The myth begins with dust, not the gentle dust that floats lazily through quiet sunlight, but the restless kind that never settles, carried endlessly by wind across wide plains where nothing stays clean for long, and where every step forward seems to invite another layer of the land to cling to you. And if you had stepped into the 1880s without warning, expecting the polished image of a cowboy shaped by movies and posters, the first thing you might notice would not be freedom or adventure, but the smell of sweat mixed with leather, smoke woven into fabric, and the faint, earthy scent of animals and open ground that followed a rider wherever he went. Because cowboys were not legends living glamorous lives, but laborers bound to the rhythm of survival and hygiene, while important to them as people, often surrendered to necessity because water was scarce, time was limited, and the demands of long cattle drives rarely paused for comfort. And so the truth of how dirty cowboys were begins not with neglect, but with adaptation, with the understanding that when you ride for 10 or 12 hours under a relentless sun, your clothing becomes a second skin layered with dust and dried sweat. And that dust is not simply brushed away because every gust of wind replaces it instantly, settling into seams, pockets, and folds of fabric until even the act of breathing feels textured. And while Eastern visitors sometimes wrote about these conditions with subtle shock, cowboys themselves rarely complained openly because hardship was expected and humor became a shield against discomfort. And so they laughed about their smell, joked about boots that could stand on their own after weeks of wear, and turned shared grime into a form of bonding that softened isolation. Yet beneath the jokes existed small rituals that preserved dignity: hats shaken out at night to remove sand and insects, bandanas rinsed whenever water allowed, hair combed with patience despite limited mirrors. And these actions reveal something important about the cowboy experience because they show that dirt did not equal carelessness, but rather a different standard shaped by environment, where cleanliness meant preventing illness or maintaining tools rather than achieving perfection. And perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in the way cowboys treated their horses, brushing them regularly even when their own clothes remained dusty because a healthy horse determined survival. And this hierarchy of care reflected practical priorities, where energy went toward what mattered most. And so the image of the filthy cowboy becomes more complicated when viewed through daily routines. Because even without frequent bathing, many men attempted small acts of washing, wiping faces with damp cloths, or standing in sudden rainstorms with quiet gratitude, as nature briefly erased weeks of buildup. And these moments were more than physical relief because they restored morale, reminding riders of a world beyond endless trails. And letters sent home often mention longing for simple comforts, like clean sheets or fresh clothing, more than excitement or danger, suggesting that the myth of endless toughness hides a quieter truth of longing and vulnerability. And when a cattle drive approached a town, the transformation could feel ceremonial. Riders entering slowly aware of watching eyes, heading toward barbers or bathhouses where warm water felt almost unreal after months of scarcity. And some accounts describe cowboys lingering in baths, as if afraid the moment would vanish too quickly, reluctant to return to dust that waited patiently outside. And clothing itself became a map of experience, shirts worn repeatedly and dried by campfires rather than washed regularly, leather chaps protecting legs while trapping heat and sweat, hats absorbing years of weather until they shaped themselves uniquely to each wearer. And boots perhaps carried the deepest connection, because once broken in, they became extensions of the body, rarely replaced despite wear because comfort outweighed appearance. And inside those boots, dust gathered silently, marking every mile traveled. And yet the question of how dirty cowboys truly were cannot be answered with a simple description because cleanliness existed on a spectrum shaped by geography, weather, and opportunity. And while weeks might pass without full bathing, many cowboys seized any chance to wash in rivers or streams, even if briefly, balancing risk and reward because cold water or unpredictable currents could turn a simple rinse into danger. And so choices about hygiene reflected constant calculation. And through all of this, the landscape itself played a role in shaping identity, blurring boundaries between person and environment until dirt became not merely something external, but a symbol of belonging. And observers from cities often misunderstood this reality, mistaking practicality for lack of refinement. Yet beneath dusty appearances existed organized systems of labor with strict routines and mutual dependence. And this hidden order challenges modern stereotypes because it reveals cowboys as disciplined workers navigating difficult conditions rather than careless wanderers. And perhaps the most fascinating element is how quickly myth transformed reality. How later storytellers romanticized the dust, turning necessity into aesthetic and struggle into symbolism, and photographs captured figures framed by wide horizons, clothing marked by travel, yet eyes reflecting resilience. And these images helped create a narrative that overshadowed daily realities. But if you listen closely to surviving accounts, you begin to hear quieter moments. Evenings around campfires where men removed hats slowly, boots placed carefully beside bedrolls, silence shared beneath vast skies filled with stars untouched by artificial light. And in those moments, dirt lost its importance because connection and rest mattered more, and conversations drifted between humor and reflection, revealing how individuals maintained identity despite isolation. And this emotional landscape adds depth to the question of cleanliness because it shows that dirt functioned as both challenge and proof, evidence of endurance and adaptation. And as railroads expanded toward the late 1880s, the nature of cowboy work slowly shifted. Long drives becoming less common, towns growing larger, access to supplies improving, and with these changes came evolving expectations about appearance and hygiene. Yet the iconic dusty image persisted because it captured something deeper than literal cleanliness, something about resilience against an environment that refused permanence. And perhaps that is why the legend continues to fascinate, because it reminds us that human beings can adapt without losing themselves. That identity can survive beneath layers of hardship. And if you stood beside a cowboy at night, listening to cattle shifting in darkness while wind carried dust across open ground, you might realize that dirt was never simply about being unclean, but about living within a world that demanded compromise, and that the real story is not how dirty cowboys were, but how they balanced necessity and dignity in a landscape that reshaped everything it touched, leaving behind not just footprints, but stories carried forward by those willing to listen long enough to hear them.